Hello and welcome. I'm Kamal Coder. I'm a technical marketing engineer in the Aruba Switching business unit. Today in this quick start guide series, I'm going to be covering the Aruba CX 6400 version 2. This is an introduction to the 6400 version 2. So let's start off with a quick introduction to the portfolio and positioning of where our 6400 sits. So we start off on the far left with our access switches, which is our 6000 and 6100 switches. Then we have our 6200 switches, which include virtual switching framework. Can you see they go from access and start to go into the aggregation layer. We then have our 6300 switches, which again they start off in the access layer and start going into the aggregation layer and closer to the core. Then we go to the subject of this quick start series, our 6400 series switches. Well, they provide access, connectivity with PoE and line cards for that type of facility, going into our aggregation and core and close to the data center, providing line cards that are capable of higher tables and higher capacity. And then across to the right we go clearly to some of our data center switches, which are the 8300, 10000, 8400 and 9300. And just here on the bottom right we have our ruggedized switches, which really around an IoT base, which provide high temperature switches in both a DIN form factor and a 1U rack mountable switch too. So let's move on and go into some more details around CX switches. So let's quickly go over some of the benefits of our Aruba CX switching portfolio. First of all, here we have a single cloud native microservices OS from access to core to DC, providing simplicity and uniformity to networks across the whole enterprise. Then we have GreenLake Aruba Central or NetEdit 2 for intelligent software defined and automated configuration and workflows and much more. Then we have Network Analytics Engine that delivers visibility with distributed analytics at the edge on every switch that supports it. And then we talk about higher availability, and we have something called virtual switching extension, which provides a high resilience chassis, including live upgrades in the core and data center. And in talking about high availability, we always have always on PoE on our access products that allows endpoints not to recycle when during reboots or upgrades of our CX switching devices. Then we have dynamic segmentation, providing an abstraction layer away from VLANs and IP, being a policy-based solution using user roles, where we have a north-south common policy for enforcement and overlay, with ClearPass Policy Manager and our Aruba gateways for policy enforcement. But we also have an east-west solution as well with a switch which we use ClearPass Policy Manager with things like VXLAN and multi-protocol BGP with EVPN, which can also use in the campus as well as the data center. And then finally, our in-house custom-built Generation 7 ASICs with full flexibility and programmability allows us to customize our switches based on where they're positioned, such as in the data center or in access. So let's dive into the 6400 version 2 update. So first of all, we have got two new chassis. They are labeled as version 2 chassis. We have a 5 slot and a 10 slot respectively, which represents the line card modules themselves, so availability of line card modules. Then we have 8 new line cards, which is split between core aggregation and access. So let me go across to the 5 slot chassis. So the 5 represents really the open slots for line cards. The chassis comes with 2 management module slots, 5 line card slots, 4 power supply slots and 2 fan tray slots. In the chassis, when you order the SKU, you get obviously the chassis with its own SKU. You get a management module populated and 1 left open, so you can order that additionally. And we populate both the fan trays in the 5 slots, so you have no fan tray modules left to populate. Moving on to the 10 slot chassis, we have again 2 management module slots, then the 10 line card module slots, 4 power supply slots and 4 fan tray slots. Included in the SKU is that we have the chassis, the 10 slot chassis. Again, we populate one of the management modules, and you can order an additional one as you require, or if you require that. And then we fully populate the switch with 4 fan tray slot, 4 fan trays as well, with no open slots left. Then let's go across to the line cards. The line card SKUs represent these top 4, which really effectively are core and aggregation and DC type of cards, and then we have 4 access cards. What I'd like to mention here now at the moment is that the 2 of the cards, these top 2 for ending 45C and 44C, these have extended table cards and effectively allows us to provide much more larger tables to provide positioning of this product or placement of this in enterprise cores as well. And we do that by manipulating the table profiles on these line cards. Something else I wanted to mention as well is that the V2 chassis supports PTP boundary clock capability, so we will need a software upgrade to be able to be used. Now, just one more thing to mention around ROX44C, which is the second card here, which has the extended tables. It can also be used for interconnectivity with 50 gig ports, and that is done by configuration of groups, and when you configure each group it disables the above ports. So this has the capability of 24 50 gig ports, and the respective 24 ports are then disabled, and that is done in the configuration. So let's dig into the scale profiles for the CX 6400 version 2. So when you apply the profiles, you can go with the default. So if you have the default and you have version 1 and version 2 modules mixed, you have 32k MAC, 49k hosts and 65,000 routes. Now, similar applies when you have V2 modules only. You have 32k routes, 49k hosts and 65k routes. Now, you can apply these 3 different profiles, but only when you're using the 44C and the 45C line card modules. And you can see that we can vary the type of MACs, hosts and routes depending on the profile, and you can see it's much more increased. We recommend that you use 10.9.1050 when using the version 2 modules, which is available later this month in September 2022. Now remember, as I mentioned here, that the scale is only appropriate to 4.4c and 4.5c. If you mix modules from version 1 and version 2, you won't be able to use that scale, and they will default back to the most common denominator, which will be the default profiles in the version 1 version 2 mix shown in this table. So now we've just talked about some of the line cards and the scale and extended tables. Let's look at some of the use cases when we could position the 6400 V2. So initially, let's look at a small campus on the left. So this small campus here, we have a core switch which is currently shown in VSF virtual switching framework, and this could be a 6300. We could replace this with a standalone 6400, which has resilience because of management modules, power supplies, fan trays, and multiple line cards. So we could use a standalone 6400, and if you wanted to be even more extravagant, you could put a 6400 in there in VSX using this configuration here. And then here in the access we do have 6300s in a virtual switching framework configuration. Let's move across now to the large campus. So in the large campus we've got a virtual switching extension for the layer 3 core, effectively using the 6400, most probably with some of the extended table cards if required for much more hosts and connectivity. We're only showing some of the campus here, and then again in the aggregation layer, again we can use the 6400 in a virtual switching extension VSX configuration. And then finally, moving down to the access, we've shown virtual switching framework in the access, which provides PoE power and the nice things around access that the 6300 could. But we could also replace these if required with a 6400, because we have all the line card capabilities for access and resilience as required, and density, and Wi-Fi 6 too, with the smart rate ports. So again, we could decide if we could have a solution that has 6400 all the way from edge, aggregation and core. So let's now move on to a data center use cases for the 6400. So we can go to a traditional 2-tier DC. We can see that we have got the 6400 here in the core in a virtual switching extension VSX configuration, and then further down in terms of the leaf of that 2-tier DC, we've got the 6400 or even 8000, but in this case 6400, providing VSX virtual switching extension, which then provides server connectivity with our 25 gig ports. Moving across to layer 3 spine and leaf, again because of the extended tables we can quite easily make these 6400s the spine, not in VSX obviously because they're independent being in the spine, but when we have them as leafs we can put them as into a VSX configuration, and then have them connecting up to multiple servers effectively in a top of rack at 25 gigs. So this hopefully shows you the flexibility of the 6400 in both server data centers using at core and at top of rack, as well as in the campus where we can have it all the way from the core aggregation and access. So I also wanted to now cover some other features around the version 1 and version 2, but specifically how the version 2 impacts that. So the first thing I'd like to say that the version 1.2 line cards will operate in the version 1 and the version 2 chassis, and the version 2 chassis line cards operate in the version 1 chassis, and hopefully obvious as it may seem, the version 2 line cards will operate in the version 2 chassis. Now, depending on the configuration that you have, you'll have certain features or may not. So obviously all the version 1 features will be supported across all line cards and chassis, both in version 1 and version 2. We now have support for 8 hardware queues, but it's only supported when you have a version 2 line card. You also have a hot swap option, but again it's only supported with version 2 line cards, but it can be in a version 1 chassis, as you can see. And obviously the scale profiles that we mentioned earlier is only applicable with the version 2 line cards, and depending on how you've got that configured. We also have in-service software upgrade support as well. For version 1 line cards you must have 10.10, and for version 2 line cards you must have 10.11, which is due to be released soon. We also have PTP boundary clock capability, but that is only applicable when you're using version 2 LAN cards in version 2 chassis. So that covers all the details around the extra features available and how you can mix and match in a line card to chassis. So now that we've gone over some of the scale and extended tables, as well as some of the features available in the version 2, let's sort of round this off with providing a bit more of an overview around the 6400 V2. So remember, we've got 8 line cards, 4 which are focused around the access, another 4 that are focused around the core aggregation. And just to be clear, there is no restriction in putting these cards in any of the 2 chassis. Remember, we can go from a gigabit port, which is in the access, all the way really providing 28 terabytes in the core. The chassis, the 5-slot chassis is 7 rack units, and the 10-slot chassis is 12 rack units. For data center purposes, we have a non-blocking distributed architecture without any oversubscription. And when we talk about the access and mobility, we have up to 480 smart rate ports available, which is great for Wi-Fi 6, providing that higher bandwidth. And in terms of PoE power, our PoE per port is up to 60 watts per port. And then our combo line cards in the access provide us with up to 50 gigs per port. And also we typically have 4 uplinks, which are also 50 gig. Remember, each line card slot provides us 2.8 terabytes per slot, which equates to 11.4 billion packets per second when we're talking about the larger switch of the two. And again, we can go up to 100 gigabit Ethernet ports, and we have a 12 port module there, which means we can support up to 120 100 gigabit ports. And of course, in terms of high availability, I've mentioned virtual switching extension, but please don't forget we have redundant hot swappable power supplies and management modules, as well as fan trays, providing us that extra high availability. Now let's cover the 6405 chassis. So as I said, it was a 7 rack unit height. We have a 7.7 inch depth for this chassis. The power supply modules are located at the top of the chassis and inserted at the front, numbered 1 to 4, left to right as you're facing it. Now we have a mirroring or a matching receptacle at the rear, which has the inlet power is connected to at the rear of the chassis, again matching the front modules, and must be paired appropriately. We have the two management slots as facing slot 1 and slot 2. Obviously the switch will operate with just one management module if you wish to do so. Then line card slots start at slot 3, numbered all the way down to slot 7, including 5 line card modules. To the rear we have 2 fan trays that were also hot swappable. Just to mention that the fan or the cooling goes from front to back, so it goes from port to power effectively. And just to complete this in terms of power, we have 3,380 watts line card power per slot, giving us a total 12,000 watts of chassis power capacity on the 6405. Similarly to the 6405, let's cover the 6410. Very similar configuration. So in terms of height, obviously it's bigger, being 12 rack units, but the same depth. We have the power bays at the top, all 4 of them, with the reciprocating matching modules at the rear, 4 of them. And then we have the management modules, slot 1 and 2, and then line cards starting at slot 3 and finishing off at slot 12. Again, the biggest difference is that we have more fan trays, which are provided with the initial SKU on day 1. And again, we have front to rear or port to power fan direction, which is non-configurable. And again, as I've mentioned a number of times, we have 2.8 terabytes per slot, giving us 28 terabytes per chassis of fabric switching. Again, similar power, we have 3,380 watts per line card, and providing us 12,000 watts of chassis capacity power. So let's cover some of the line cards in detail, starting off with the access line cards. So we have a 48 port 1 gigabit Ethernet class 4 PoE, providing us with 30 watts of power per port with no uplinks. This is really meant for density at the access. Then we follow that with a 48 port 1 gigabit Ethernet copper, again class 4, providing us 30 watts of power. However, this time this module has 4 SFP56, providing us up to 50 gig of uplinks. Then we have the 48 port class 6 PoE, which provides us with 48 ports of 60 watts power, and again 450 gig uplinks. And finally, we have for the Wi-Fi 6, or we have this smart rate port, which provides us with smart rate as well as 60 watts PoE with 450 gig uplinks. So now we go on to the core and aggregation cards. So we have 4 of these as well. So we start off with the high capacity card here, which has 48 ports as SFP28 modules. Remember, this card can also have 50 gig in the lower ports, when disabling the upper ports by configuration if required. So this is a high capacity card. Then we go to the next card here, which is a 12 port QSFP, which supports up to 100 gig. This is also a high capacity card with profiles. And then we go to the 10 gig copper based 24 port 10 gig based T card here, which also provides us with 50 gig uplinks. And then finally we have the 24 port SFP56 card, which also provides us with 450 gig uplinks. So I wanted to cover the power supplies and inlet adapters, and you can see from the graphic that we have the power supply module and the inlet adapter, which are mated respectively. And so you would input one of these modules, and this would be paired with another module at the back, providing you your source power. Remember, depending on the country you are at, you will get different power. So 200, 240 volts, 1800 watts, and then 110 to 127 input, you get 1100 watts. When you're using the C16 inlet adapters, and then you get higher capacity, obviously with the C20 inlet adapters, you can get up to 3000 watts or 1500 depending on your input AC power. So really here we have just a summary of all the SKUs and the hardware available for version 2 chassis and cards. Obviously, if you need a extra management module, you can order this specific management module for your chassis. These are all different line cards, and obviously if you need different type of mounting, you have this 4-post rack kit, and if you needed a spare fan tray, similarly you could order them as required. So as we draw towards the end of this quick start guide, just do a quick comparison between the two different switches. So obviously both switches have a capacity for up to 2 management modules. The 5 slot and the 10 slot have different line cards, but as I said earlier, there is no restrictions in having line cards in either of the chassis, so it depends on what you want for your infrastructure. Obviously the fan trays are different. You have 2 for the 5 slot and 4 for the 10 slot. And then the PSUs you can use either on either of the chassis, but only up to 4 PSUs and inlet adapters respectively. So drawing to a conclusion on this 6400 V2 platform, I've covered performance, scale and high availability. We know that now we have 8 new line cards, specifically focused 4 on the access and 4 on the aggregation, providing us with much better scale. And we see the numbers here, so it means that our 6400 can quite easily be positioned in the access, in the aggregation and in the core as well, close to the data center or in the data center. And all the numbers that I provided in terms of 28 terabyte core, non-blocking distributed architecture without oversubscription, leads to this product being very versatile and flexible, and hopefully you're able to deploy this in your enterprise. So all I can say now is thank you for watching this quick start guide. I hope this was useful and informative for you.